Sarante gently placed the wounded elf, Brigia, on the bed. Taking a seat nearby, he rested a hand on the edge of the bed. As Ronan approached, arms crossed, Sarante explained that he had completed the first aid and could now relax a bit. Ronan, still staring at Brigia, asked Sarante if she was really okay. He explained to Sarante that even healing magic hadn't worked, and that if she had been poisoned, she would soon die. Turning to Ronan, Sarante closed his eyes and smiled, reassuring him not to worry. He had given her an antidote first, so she would be fine. Sarante told Ronan that he owed him a debt of gratitude because, without his help, he would have lost his precious sister. Hearing this, Ronan lowered his head slightly towards Brigia and, looking into her eyes, asked Sarante if she really was his sister. Sarante also lowered his head, gazing intently at Brigia, and explained to Ronan that she was one of the few remaining believers of Senial in this world. He added that she once had the deepest faith, a belief stronger than anyone else's. Turning to Ronan, Sarante admitted that he didn't know how to repay such a great debt for saving his sister. Ronan, meeting Sarante's gaze and placing a hand behind his head, asked him not to make things sound so grandiose. After saying this, Ronan, with a lost expression, looked down and asked Sarante who those people were that had Brigia so worried. He also mentioned that she had warned him his life was in danger. Upon hearing this, Sarante lowered his head, gazing at the ground in silence. Several minutes later, Ronan and Sarante arrived at the sacred rock. Sarante placed his hands on his abdomen as they both stood there, gazing at the rock. Sarante then confessed to Ronan that he didn't know what Brigia was talking about. Ronan turned to Sarante, looking somewhat confused. Sarante explained that all he knew was that it was a religious group worshipping an unknown being as a god. They had been committing various evils beyond his comprehension, all while keeping their true identity hidden. He then revealed to Ronan that this group called themselves the Order. Upon hearing this, Ronan became both alert and panicked. Sarante, with his hands behind his back, slightly turned his head towards Ronan, locking eyes with him as he revealed that the group's name was Nebula Clasia. Shocked, Ronan quickly took several steps back and, staring directly at Sarante, asked if it was true that the Nebula Clasia group was targeting him. Sarante turned towards him, keeping his hands behind his back, and surmised that Ronan had indeed heard of the Nebula Clasia before. He revealed that the group had also sent him quite a few guests over the years. Closing his eyes with a smile, Sarante explained to Ronan that the last 100 years had been peaceful, leading him to believe they had given up. However, now it seemed they were on the move once again. Ronan's anger flared up. He tightened his fist and insisted to Sarante that this was a serious matter that couldn't be ignored. Urgently, Ronan advised Sarante to go to the institution, but before Ronan could finish, Sarante interrupted him, closed his eyes, and shook his head, explaining that he couldn't leave this place and risk endangering people's lives. Simultaneously, the sun's rays began to interact with the magical barrier surrounding the temple, making it visible. Sarante explained to Ronan that relocating would endanger the residents of the place, something he wished to avoid. He approached Ronan, placing a hand on his shoulder, and urged him and his friends to leave quickly. As Sarante gazed into Ronan's eyes with a gentle smile, he expressed his desire to shield them from unnecessary danger. He hoped Ronan understood his intentions. Ronan raised his head slightly towards Sarante, meeting his gaze in silence. Several minutes later, Ronan and Sarante arrived at the temple exit. Ronan requested that Sarante wait there while he fetched the strongest woman he knew. Sarante remained silent, which angered Ronan. Pointing at Sarante, he sternly ordered him to continue hiding and not to take any reckless actions until then. Sarante closed his eyes and brought his hand near his face, smiling as he replied that he would hide very effectively. He then took Ronan's hand and placed something in it, explaining that it was his token of gratitude for saving Brigia. Ronan looked somewhat surprised, examining Sarante's hand and asking what it was. When Ronan opened his hand, he found a ring given to him by Sarante. The ring emitted a strong green mana. Sarante explained that it served as a pass to enter the magic tower. Should Ronan visit the Tower of Dawn, he needed to show the ring to the librarian, who could assist him in seeking information about his curse. Sarante took Ronan's hand firmly and asked him to take care. After these words, he lifted his head and looked deeply into Ronan's eyes, surprising him somewhat. Sarante closed his eyes and, with a warm smile, expressed to Ronan that the time they had spent together in the past few days had been a genuine gift to him. Ronan sighed, scratching his head, and asked Sarante why he was saying things as if they would never see each other again. He questioned the sentimentality and found it embarrassing. With that said, Ronan hurried out of the temple, making his way towards Maria and the others, putting distance between himself and Sarante. He assured Sarante that he would return soon and urged him to take care. After Ronan departed, Sarante approached the temple wall, placing both hands on it and sighing as he looked down. Turning his head slightly, he cast a sinister glance and quietly expressed his satisfaction at seeing his old companion after such a long absence. He turned toward his former companion, and as she walked away, referred to her as the Order's assassin. At that moment, Brigia's demeanor shifted. She glanced back at Sarante, asking with a smile why he had brought up their past. Turning fully towards him, she locked eyes with a haunting gaze and inquired if he had been living comfortably all this time. Sarante clenched both fists and fixed his gaze on the assassin, remarking that the Order was cruel for selecting her as an assassin and sending her here. She retorted that it was rich coming from him, having administered a paralyzing poison to a patient. Sarante asserted confidently that there was nothing he couldn't do. He also mentioned to her that the shadow of Lemmeheim had been captured by an orc. The assassin closed her eyes, spreading her hands to the sides, and with a smile, she responded that it was beyond her control. She added that getting to know Sarante had been quite challenging. Despite her attempts to draw Sarante's attention with the monsters, as she had anticipated, it had all been futile. A few days earlier, while perched on a tree branch, she spotted Ronan and the others. Her smile turned ominous as she observed them, realizing they emitted the same mana as Sarante. Initially, she contemplated gaining his attention by dismembering Ronan and the others, scattering them. Turning her gaze to Sarante, she smiled and mentioned she had restrained herself, recalling their shared history as believers. After saying this, she questioned whether he felt any emotion. Just before she could finish speaking, Sarante interrupted her. With a menacing gaze, he locked eyes with her and stated firmly that he wouldn't have allowed her to carry out such actions. The assassin spread her hands out to the sides and chuckled, asking Sarante if she wasn't allowed to joke anymore. After this remark, she moved closer to Sarante and suggested they stop talking for the sake of talking. She disclosed that she was going to relinquish the mandate of the Order. As she drew closer, Sarante calmly placed his hands behind his back and said nothing. Their eyes locked as she explained that the mandate was to persuade Sarante Remation. Slowly, she started unsheathing her sword. In response, Sarante activated his magic, conjuring a mana ball in the palm of his hand. She clarified that if Sarante Remation refused, she would have to kill him. Immediately they launched into combat, triggering a powerful explosion that reverberated through the forest. The ground shook under the force of the blast. Sensing this, Ronan, who was in motion, halted and turned towards the temple, pondering the source of the disturbance. He shifted his gaze towards the temple and muttered about the unsettling sensation. While absorbed in his thoughts, Ursela and Braum approached him. Spotting Ronan, the three hurried over and called out to grab his attention. Hearing their voices, Ronan turned slightly towards them. As Maria and the others reached Ronan, he thought they had arrived at just the right moment. He asked Maria if she had walked around the village community and discovered any other captives. She stepped closer to Ronan, meeting his gaze, and responded that they had searched everywhere but found no problems. She also informed him that Ursel had discovered something suspicious. Ronan approached Ursel and, placing both hands on his knees, closed his eyes and caught his breath. Ursel explained to Ronan that shortly after he had left, they had found something unusual in the corpses of the orcs. He explained that it was the first time he had seen those magic circles. Ronan, confused, stared at Ursel and asked which magic circles he meant. Before Ursel could respond, a sudden explosion erupted behind them, startling them all. Everyone turned their heads towards the direction of the explosion. Braum asked Ronan if it was an explosion, while Ursel wondered if it had come from the temple. Ronan stared at the blast with growing fear and concern for Sarante. Suddenly, the ground trembled as a massive ogre stomped forcefully nearby. The ground trembling, Ronan and his companions were startled and began to speculate about the cause. Ronan glanced to the side and saw a massive figure approaching. Suddenly, the two-headed giant ogre, known as the leader of the ogres, emerged. They turned back in shock at the sight of the ogre, feeling fear creeping in. The ogre roared loudly, leaving Ronan and the others bewildered as to where such a creature had come from. Meanwhile, in the Temple of Senial, the assassin's attack began to create cracks in the structure. Unsheathing her sword, she gained momentum and charged swiftly towards Sarante. Seeing this, he activated several spells, fixing her with a murderous gaze. Extending his hand towards her, he slowly invoked a spell, causing a magic circle to appear in his palm. Sarante invoked the spell Ventus and began to levitate. Extending his hand towards the assassin, he prepared to strike. Within seconds, his spell conjured a mana tornado. The swirling vortex advanced towards the assassin, causing her hair to whip wildly. Instead of dodging, she stood silently, watching the approaching tornado. The assassin advanced towards Sarante, her eyes locked onto him intently. With a smile, she told him that this was exactly what she wanted. Gripping her sword tightly, a sticky substance oozed onto the blade and dripped slowly to the ground. She extended the sword to one side, and the blade began to emit a dark, malevolent energy. She raised her hand in front of her face, staring intensely at Sarante with a murderous look, and began to smile as she prepared to strike. With a sinister grin and gaze, she advanced, bringing her sword closer to Sarante. Then, she unleashed a powerful attack, causing a mighty burst of energy to shoot out from the sword's tip. The burst of energy rapidly advanced towards the tornado Sarante had conjured. Within seconds, the energy collided with the tornado, resulting in a massive explosion. As the leaves fell to the ground and the dust clouds slowly dissipated, the aftermath of their clash became visible. The assassin and Sarante faced each other, their gazes locked intensely, neither making a move. As the assassin fixed her stare on Sarante, she extended her sword to one side and began to advance. At first, Sarante remained motionless, observing her approach. As the assassin slowly approached, Sarante extended his hand to one side, activating a spell that caused powerful mana to emanate from his palm. He readied himself to attack, but in an instant, the assassin gained momentum and vanished, leaving him bewildered. She moved with incredible speed, and in the blink of an eye, reached Sarante. With a murderous look, she unsheathed her sword and swiftly aimed it at his head. As the blade neared, Sarante was taken aback, unable to comprehend how she had moved so fast. Just before her sword could reach Sarante's head, he cast a spell and activated a shield, deflecting the blow. Her sword struck the shield, generating a powerful energy that spread in all directions. The assassin, staring at Sarante, couldn't help but smile with excitement. Sarante gazed into her eyes, and upon seeing her expression, fell silent. Moments later, the magical barrier he had created exploded, forming a curtain of smoke. Both the assassin and Sarante quickly gained momentum and moved away from each other. A few seconds later, the assassin descended to the ground, followed shortly by Sarante. As the smoke cleared, she drew her sword once more and fixed a steady gaze on Sarante. He remained silent upon seeing her readiness. During the explosion of the magic barrier, the assassin received a small cut on her cheek, which she wiped clean with her hand. Looking down, she smiled to herself, thinking that Sarante was indeed as cunning as an old fox. After wiping the blood from her cheek, she fixed her gaze on Sarante and smiled, considering it would be a waste to kill him. She suggested he join them, offering him an executive position similar to hers. Before she could finish, Sarante interrupted, rejecting her offer due to his strong religious convictions against serving a cult. With a fierce stare fixed on the assassin, he extended his hand and began channeling mana. Within seconds, a powerful green aura enveloped his body as he continued to gaze intently at her. He smiled and taunted her, remarking that she had become too rusty and that Lemmerheim's shadow was disappointingly slow. After saying this, He questioned whether the teachings of the Order no longer resonated with her. The assassin closed her eyes briefly, placed a hand on her face, and smiled in response. She admitted that she was feeling a bit bored. Slowly opening her eyes, she continued, explaining to Sarante that he had been so preoccupied with buying time for the children to escape that he hadn't paid attention to her. Surprised by her words, he began to wonder about her intentions. She disclosed to Sarante that she understood he had taken the desperate measure to keep Ronan out of danger and allow him to depart with a clear conscience. She admitted this piqued her curiosity. Lowering her arms, she remarked that she knew Sarante had no attachment to this world. She questioned why he was protecting Ronan. Sarante looked down and explained that Ronan and the others were mere acquaintances he had encountered by chance. He warned her not to harm them without cause. Sarante's anger grew evident as his body radiated powerful mana. With a murderous glare, he cautioned the assassin that if she overstepped, it would be hard for him to let her leave unscathed. Upon hearing this, she advanced towards him with a murderous gaze, smiling mockingly as she taunted him about being scared. Licking her lips, she asked Sarante what could be done now that things had escalated. Suddenly, a powerful explosion shook the forest, visible even from the temple. The sound of the explosion prompted a drastic change in Sarante's expression. Fear gripped him as he pondered what was unfolding. Turning swiftly towards the source of the blast, he clenched his teeth in dread. His horror intensified as he realized Ronan and the others were in that direction. Lost in thought, Sarante was caught off guard as the assassin suddenly appeared behind him. With a murderous gaze, she poised herself to strike with her sword. Sarante panicked upon sensing her presence, swiftly turning to find her ready to attack. With a smug smile, the assassin declared she had found an opening in him. Sarante attempted to defend himself against the attack, but his efforts proved futile. The assassin struck with her sword, cutting his hand in the process. Meanwhile, in the forest where Ronan and the others were, the two-headed ogre appeared and began roaring. One of its heads fixed its gaze on Ronan and the group, drooling as it let out a deafening roar. As the ogre's drool dripped slowly toward the ground, Maria, Acel and Braum were seized with terror, wondering where the two-headed ogre had come from and what was happening. They were paralyzed with fear as the ogre stared at them with a menacing glare. Ronan drew his sword and approached them, shouting for them to gather their wits and stand behind him, knowing none of them could face the ogre alone. One of the ogre's heads fixed a murderous gaze on Ronan and grinned menacingly. Swiftly, the ogre lunged toward Braum, aiming to attack him by surprise, causing Braum to freeze in terror. Braum turned his head toward the approaching ogre hand, his teeth clenched tightly as he attempted to dodge, but fear paralyzed him, leaving him unable to move in time. The ogre's powerful blow slammed into Braum, inflicting intense pain upon him. His body was surrounded by a crimson aura as he was hurled sideways, crashing heavily into a nearby tree. Acel and Maria watched in horror as Maria turned her head toward Braum, her mind racing with questions about what had just occurred. Acel turned her head back and was horrified to see Braum's body flung away. She questioned aloud who the ogre was and what it wanted. Braum collided with a tree and lost consciousness. Maria and Acel rushed to help him, but their efforts were interrupted as the two-headed ogre started advancing toward them. Moments before the ogre's fist could strike, someone dashed forward and appeared in front of them in an instant, surprising everyone. It was Ronan. Drawing his sword swiftly, he intercepted the ogre's punch, generating a powerful gust of wind. The gust swept toward Maria and Acel, leaving them speechless as they witnessed Ronan successfully halting the ogre's attack. Seeing Ronan successfully block its strike, the two-headed ogre became disoriented. It gritted its teeth fiercely, and glaring aggressively at Ronan, let out a roar. As Ronan held off the ogre's attack with his sword, he glanced briefly towards the ground, catching Maria and Acel's attention. Ronan instructed Acel and Maria to take Sita and attend to Braum. Acel reacted with surprise, while Maria clenched her teeth, pondering Ronan's intentions. Ronan tightened his grip on the sword's hilt, his body trembling slightly. He raised his head defiantly, fixing a fierce gaze on the ogre's eyes. Through gritted teeth, He declared that this ogre was his to kill.